welcome to the first session of our course on the sacraments. And perhaps helpfully, we're going to start by thinking about what actually is a sacrament. But I wonder, Sharon and Jim, if you could take us back to your earliest memories of being involved in sacraments. What comes to your mind, Sharon?
For me, I remember when I was at church, which was a majority um, Caribbean church, and I remember the sacraments where we didn't have them that often
Yeah,
actually, about once every 3 or 4 months. And it would be a very special thing where these little communion cups would come out and then some sliced bread. But of course, as children, we weren't allowed
yeah,
to partake with the adults. And it was such a sort of hushed, reverent service. And, we were kind of given stares if we were made any noise or anything like that. But the adults, often there were tears
mm,
and this kind of penitential atmosphere about taking bread and wine, taking the Eucharist. But we didn't call it Eucharist, we called it communion.
yeah.
But the children were there to observe, not to participate.
But you got this sense of some kind of atmosphere which was quite heavy
Absolutely.
by the sound of it.
Yeah, it was very heavy. I think the emphasis was on how wrong we were as
Oh,
humans, as
yes.
adults, and therefore adults couldn't take it without confessing. And if they took it wrongly, then there would be some repercussions.
Yeah,
And I do remember that,
yeah,
feeling quite scared about
yeah.
that.
And
Yeah.
let's come back to that because I think we may have lost a lot of that for good reasons and bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
What
yeah.
about you, Jim? What's your earliest memory of being involved in sacraments?
Well, quite a contrasting experience. I grew up in a Catholic tradition in the Church of England, and so very strong sense of the sacraments. Certainly was taught that there were seven of them in my
Yeah.
confirmation
Yeah.
classes. And the rhythm of the parish was what we called the Mass, the Eucharist. But I think in my childhood memories, what really sticks with me was the sense of how this kind of worship really spoke to all the senses, the
Mm.
smell of the incense, the color of the vestments, the sound of the music, and everything. And so a real sense of the sacred, of something, yes, mysterious, but also um, intelligible in the sense of kind of these are signs of God's presence here and God's
Mm.
action here.
Mm. What Sharon was describing, the seriousness of it, of not entering into this sacrament without repentance, did that figure at all as far as you can remember?
That was certainly a strong part of it, but I have a slightly more positive sense of a kind of a delight in worship and a real celebration of the mass and of the people of God, um, uh, obeying the Lord's commands.
Mm.
Mm.
Mine are all frivolous, my earliest memories, I'm afraid. It's very shocking. I was born and baptized into the Church of South India, and my parents were ministering at the time. And my earliest memory of being involved in a sacrament was my youngest sister being baptized. And I swallowed, I was given something to put in the communion plate, in the collection plate. And what I was given was a 12-sided threepenny bit, which a lot of people won't remember at all. And I swallowed it.
Yeah.
Obviously, intending to take all the attention away from my younger sister, whose moment this was, and focus it on me. I won't tell you any more of that story because it gets disgusting after that. But that sense of being involved in celebrating something that my little sister was being brought into a community that wasn't just our particular family, but the wider family of people who were welcoming her and promising to help her grow up as a Christian, which I do remember despite swallowing the threepenny bit. I also remember my children when they were small, exactly as you were describing, Sharon, that sense of not being able to participate in communion. And I remember my daughter in particular frequently holding up her hands at the communion rail, saying, "One for me," and trying to explain to her why this is something you need to grow into, that particular sacrament. I suppose we've all been talking a little bit about sacraments in our own memories, but people who are joining us on this course um, may be thinking, well, we've always been thinking that a sacrament is is a very churchy kind of thing, and not something that we really understand at all. And these memories that we've been sharing that are about celebration, but also about seriousness, how do they help people understand what a sacrament actually is? Do you think? That's a tricky question, Sharon, that I'm going to pose to you.
I know. Well, I just had a memory of when I was about 16 and started to realize there was something profoundly serious about the sacraments. And for me at that age, the sacraments were around baptism
Yeah.
and communion, the Eucharist. And it was at that age when I started to seriously think about the wonder of God and getting an understanding and a glimpse that God really loved me, not just, this kind of more wider notion that God loves everyone. God loved me as Sharon and with all my foibles and everything else. And this idea that I was profoundly connected to a much larger sense of God's creation as well. And that filled me with a sense of wonder. And I think there's something about talking about the wonder and the mystery that the sacraments allude to. And for me at 16, there was this great adventure about trying to understand what is this mysterious sacredness that God is calling me into, which is visible by these outward signs, because I was preparing for my baptism as I came from a denomination where we had full immersion.
Yeah.
And that was like you really went under the water and came back up again. And that to me was this huge transition, this sort of rite of initiation into the church proper, even though I'd been going to the church as a child. But this was a really big thing. And the church family themselves made it a really sort of profound event as well. And I remember entering into this with my church family, thinking that this marks a transition. And so going back to your question, Jane, I think instances where people are invited into this, not just those special occasions, but actually start to talk about the wonder and the mystery and the awe of God is part of that.
Thank you. That's so helpful, because I'm wanting to pick up quite a lot of those themes in this course and make the sacraments feel less just churchy and something that somebody does somewhere else, and that we as lay people, I am a lay person myself, that we just receive and have no opinions about. And that age, 16, is a really significant age in all kinds of ways, what's going on in the whole of your life. And to, at that point, really say, this is going to be the direction I take, and these people are going to help me take it. That's a profoundly important thing to do, isn't it?
It is. I was just thinking it's about identity, isn't it? And also knowing that you're totally accepted as you.
Yeah.
How do we connect people with that sense that they're loved as they are?
Exactly. Yes. And what age, Jim, do you remember first taking communion?
I was confirmed at 10,
Right.
and that was still the time when you had to be confirmed in order to receive communion. And I remember that being a very special moment. I think we had to get the bishop's permission because I ought to have been 1 year older or something like that. I was very keen to do it. But I did still have a sense. I grew up in a choir, and singing was very much kind of the way in which I participated in worship. So there was certainly a profound deepening of my participation in the church community after that point. But I think I hadn't felt excluded, I don't think.
No. And I mean, that is very young, but you had to did you have to sort of demonstrate that you were ready in any way at the age of 10? Did somebody ask you difficult questions?
I think I did have to kind of have a special meeting with the vicar, and then certainly very rigorous confirmation preparation.
I actually remember a little bit of the sermon that was preached when my admittance to communion, by a bishop whose name was Bishop. So that was that helped to remember. But he was preaching on that verse from Revelation about a door opening in heaven. And I think that's always been quite key for me, that sense of he was sort of giving me a vision of what I was actually participating in, where it's not just something that we as human beings do as a ritual, but it's a gift that comes from the reality of God and takes you into a different kind of world. And as I say, as a lay person myself, and again, I hope we'll go on and talk about this a bit later, I don't actually preside at communion. I don't draw the people around the table. But I feel very strongly that those who do draw us around the table, that's what they're doing. They're drawing us. They're not doing it for us. They're drawing us around the table. So this idea of the community that we're part of, that both of you have mentioned, has been really significant. I found that when I discovered that the word sacrament comes, at least in one part of its derivation, from what Roman soldiers used to take, I found that really helpful, that oath that Roman soldiers used to take, that they were committing themselves to this terrible institution in the case of the Roman army, but committing themselves to it utterly. So that was going to become their life and their family, you might say. I found that actually quite helpful, helping me to realise the level of commitment that's being talked about, which possibly brings together both what you were talking about, Sharon, the seriousness, and what you were talking about, Jim, about the joyfulness, the whole experience.
I think certainly the sense of being bound to other people is what I appreciated about learning about that definition, and the sense that sacraments are about action. So that the language of the tradition is one of signs, and I think we think of signs as rather sort of static things, like sort of, as you talk about the highway code and sort of street signs, but they're signs of action, signs of what God is doing. And I think as I grew older, kind of after my confirmation, really sort of understood more that this was a call to me to be drawn into the action of God in the world. And that was what got me excited about Christian faith. Yeah, again, sort of later in my teens, I think.
And it's that wonderful public way of being as well. And we're talking about, those special services where people acknowledge this particular sign, but it's also, you're not doing it as an individual, you're doing it as part of a community. And that, for me, that public declaration, and yet also knowing that you had the support of others to journey with you at that key point, whether it be every week or whether it be a one-off occasion, is so vital. But I also, for me, made me realise that my understanding of sacraments was actually quite narrow as well, that there was something about the presence of God being with me no matter where I was, and that there was a sacred sacramental moment as well. And it could involve reminders of when I participated in my baptism and later confirmation, or I took communion, but there was something that almost as if there was a grace with me, a grace working through me in the activity that really resonates with me. And that's when I remember. That's when I remember. Because sometimes I think life crowds that memory out.
But that's so helpful that it's not just something we participate in and then leave. And leave it behind. It's something we take with us. And that, again, I think is quite countercultural, actually, this sense that it is about our personal faith, but it's also a faith that we're committed to together.
When I was growing up, people still used that phrase, making my communion. And I remember the vicar being very insistent, there is no such thing as my communion. It's always ours, always us.
I love that. I really do, because there's this idea that when we gather together, it's so profound, and that it isn't just an individual act, which often doesn't have any other purpose other than sort of I and God, but it actually is about us together.
Thank you so much for joining us for this first session. We hope you will want to come back for the second one, and we'll see you there.